Good afternoon, everybody. Please take a seat and we'll make a start. I hope you enjoyed that little teaser video. So welcome to ADB's annual commemorative event in celebration of the International Day for the Elimination Against Violence, or IDEVAW. We have several external guests with us today, so welcome, as well as I understand over 100 people online, and that number is climbing as we speak. I know most people in the room, but for the benefit of our external guests, my name is Samantha Hung, and I'm the Director of Gender Equality here at ADB. I'm actually going to be stepping in for my colleague, Yolanda Fernandez-Loman, who was meant to do the welcome remarks, but she's not very well. So I've got her prepared speech, but I will also maybe elaborate a little bit. So I think for many of us in the room, and definitely those of us that work on gender equality, we know that gender-based violence is a critical issue that intersects with many of the development challenges of the region and the projects that ADB works on. We also recognize that without addressing gender-based violence, we really can't fully achieve any of these development goals. And it is for this reason that ADB yesterday, along with 10 other multilateral development banks, for the first time committed to a joint statement on addressing and eliminating gender-based violence on the occasion of IDEVAW, and we're really proud of that. Through a range of prevention, support for survivors, improved access to justice, and a range of other holistic responses. That statement is available online, and all other MDBs are also posting that in their respective time zones. We know that the journey towards eliminating gender-based violence requires a holistic response, and that requires addressing strengthening laws and the implementation, ensuring that institutions work, especially for survivors, challenging deeply entrenched behaviors and social norms. And that really takes us to the topic of today, because we know that without addressing the role of men and boys and their roles and their attitudes, we can't really achieve this transformation. And we must recognize that the way society or societies have defined what it is to be a man in different versions of masculinities can either help or hinder these efforts. And so that video that you just saw was part of our effort to have this conversation here in ADB, and we asked a cross-section of male colleagues how they saw healthy masculinities without giving them any prompts. And I was really encouraged, actually, one, to see how enthusiastic they were to answer the question, and secondly, to see the sorts of answers we were getting through that and the quotes that they shared. That video can be made available. It's on our social media, and it's actually showing in the Staff Hub this week. So without taking too much time, the main session today will actually hear from leading researchers and experts who are actually working at the forefront of this very issue, addressing masculinity and gender-based violence. And together, they will discuss a range of evidence-based interventions aimed at transforming masculinity positively from across the Asia and Pacific region, as well as some ADB-supported research on men and masculinities in Mongolia. And this groundbreaking Mongolian research explores significant links between rigid masculine norms and gender-based violence, offering some really valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities we can draw from to actually influence positive change through our work. So as we embark on this dialogue, I think we all know that this is a collective ambition, not just for men or women, but for everyone in society. And it really takes a together call of action to create a situation in society where gender-based violence in all its forms are no longer tolerated and where healthy masculinities flourish. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment and shared commitment to this cause. And with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Imrana Jalal, who is the Special Project Facilitator for ADB's Accountability Mechanism. She actually heads the office. And many of you will know that she has a very strong background in gender equality and women's rights. So she will moderate the session. So I would like to invite Imrana, as well as the three speakers that we have here with us in the room, and we also have two online, to come up, take their seats, and Imrana can start her moderation. Thank you very much. There's a clicker here if anyone needs them. Okay, there's a clicker if anyone needs.
afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Asian Development Bank's event for today, Transforming Masculinities to End Gender-Based Violence. As you know, November 25 every year to 10th of December heralds the 16 days of activism against violence against women globally, and there are women's NGOs and organizations all over the world that participate in activities to end GBV. And one of the symbols of that is the orange. So no, I don't belong to some cult. This is actually Orange Day, yesterday and today. Now, before I introduce our wonderful panelists, I just want to say a few words. When I became a feminist and an activist in the 1980s, the late 80s, yes, I'm really old, the theory in those days that we did not want to include men. And it was a very deliberate decision, actually, that we did not want them to participate in our discussions. We did not want them to participate in our activism because basically we felt that they would take over the conversation and lead it. So for 20, 30 years, that was the theory behind it. And there were probably good reasons in those days to have that perspective. Now the conversation has changed. We do realize and accept through the process of evolution that unless we tackle traditional notions of masculinity, very little will change in the end. And to do that, we need to include men in the conversation. And this event today is part of that process. So here to discuss this engaging and interesting topic, we have a wonderful set of people. I'm not sure, do we have Michael and Samita online as well? Oh, we do. Thank you. Wonderful. Welcome, Michael. So we have 5 people here who will tackle this difficult and complex subject. Ravi Verma, the regional director from the Asian Regional Office of the International Centre for Research on Women. Michael Flood, professor and from the School of Justice, Queensland University of Technology. Samita Sugatimala, co-chair from the Men Engage Global Violence from Sri Lanka. Saranzaya Gerelt Odd, the senior gender officer from the ADB resident mission in Mongolia. And James Lang, who is based here with us, the senior specialist, gender-based violence officer specialist from the Gender Equality Division of the Asian Development Bank. Now, before we ask the panelists to deal with some of the questions that we have of them, I'd like to ask James to set the context for us by helping us what is meant by masculinity and what is meant by transforming masculinity. Now, I use that tone, James, because when I posed this question to my father, he asked me exactly like that. What do you mean masculinity? And what do you mean transforming masculinity? Please help us understand that and set the context. Thank you, James.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Imrana. And colleagues, thank you for being here. So this is a contested definition, and I'm sure other panelists will have other nuances to this response. But let me just say very simply, at an individual level, masculinities are ways to be men, ways we can act out in our lives and our relationship as men. And this is fluid. So we use the term masculinities, and that means there's different ways to be men, and they change across time, across place, across cultures. But in addition to that, we value some of these ways over others, right? So not only is it about individuals and the way we act out as men, but it's also how we value different ways to be men and how this is stratified in hierarchies across different societies. So there are some others that talk, when we talk about masculinities beyond just individual men, we can talk about them as discourses of power. So these discourses of power value some ways to be men over others, and it's embedded in not only our bodies and our relationships, but in our institutions, in our laws, And these, the one other thing I wanted to say about these discourses of power, they're very much framed by ways that we promote, some men over others, or some ways of being men over others that are connected to our identities. So we use intersectionality often to analyze vulnerability, but intersectionality can also be used to analyze power and privilege. So some men, according to their class, their caste, their race, are valued over others. And this is when we talk about masculinities in a plural sense as a discourse of power. So what do we want to change? How do we transform masculinities? It's not an easy task, and this is the topic of our discussion today, but just to say that we want to promote ways of being men, or masculinities, that are nonviolent, that are oriented towards peace, that are gender equitable and oriented towards social justice, that are emotionally intelligent and oriented towards healthy lifestyles and healthy relationships.
Thank you, James. Thank you for setting the context for us. So this question goes to Michael online. So Michael, you are an academic who has been working for many years on the issue of men, masculinities, and violence prevention. Can you tell us, based on your experience, some of the ways that you have engaged men and boys in GBV prevention? Which boys, when, how? What works and what is not working? So if I could ask you to address that within 5 minutes, I'd be grateful. Thank you, Michael.
In the interest of time, I will go straight to my answer rather than anything else by way of thanks. But look, the first thing we should know is there's a field. There's a field of work engaging men and boys around the world, an engaging men or healthy masculinities field. We're seeing a proliferation of projects and initiatives aimed at men and boys, particularly around violence prevention, but also around fathering, around sexual and reproductive health, HIV/AIDS, and so on. There's a growing number of organisations with a dedicated focus on this area. There's growing attention to men and boys in the prevention plans of national governments, and there's a growing body of scholarship. And for me as an academic, it's useful to know that there's data. There's data showing that well-designed interventions among men and boys can make a difference. So to talk about what works, one common strategy, for example, is community education, face-to-face education among groups of boys or young men, whether in a school or a village or elsewhere. And we know that well-designed community education that's multi-session, that's interactive, that's participatory, and so on, can shift the attitudes and behaviours related to domestic and sexual violence and can lower rates of actual perpetration. Another strategy for education involves communications and social marketing. And again, well-designed interventions, particularly comprehensive media strategies that are complemented by on-the-ground efforts in communities, local marches or rallies or community education events on the ground, they, again, can make change in community norms and attitudes. We know less about whether they lower rates of actual violence because often the research hasn't been done or because it's very hard to measure that at a community level. A third strategy is educating providers, and there's a growing body of work with judges, with police, with lawyers, and many of those are male-dominated professions, and there are gender-sensitive examples of that work, including also with coaches and faith leaders. Again, it shows positive impact if done well. A fourth strategy is mobilising communities. Now, of course, the only reason we can talk about this issue at all is because of women's rights and anti-violence advocacy and social movements. And mobilising men is an important part of this work. If we can mobilise men as allies and advocates working alongside women and other gender diverse people, that makes change for those allies themselves and potentially change in their communities. There's also whole of institution change where you work with an entire sporting code or an entire community or an entire school. And multi-level, multi-pronged strategies make change. Finally, law and policy makes a difference. And so for the policymakers and funders in the room, I can point to the good news that higher levels of funding for addressing domestic and sexual violence lead to lower levels of violence in communities themselves. So in terms of what works, there are some things that work across those different strategies. Our work with men and boys needs to be informed by strong, feminist, evidence-based understandings of the problem. It needs to be comprehensive, more than one-off, small scale. It needs to be large scale, multi-strategy. It needs to be engaging. It needs to speak to the realities of men's and boys' lives and offer them the hope of richer, healthier lives. Finally, it needs to be relevant and intersectional. It needs to be tailored to the diverse communities and contexts in which it's delivered.
Thank you, Michael. You still had 1 minute and 37 seconds left.
Let me give it to the other panelists of the room.
And of course, one of the issues you raised will be discussed by Ravi later on in terms of an example of a specific type of campaign. However, before that, our next question is to Samita. Samita, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
All right, great. So you've been working as the co-chair of the Men Engage Global Alliance, and I believe you are the first woman to hold that position. So can you tell us a little bit about the Men Engage Global Alliance, Samita? How did you begin? What is your mandate? What is the scope of work that you do? Thank you.
Fine. Thank you, Imran. So as Michael, I will straight go to the content because of the time constraints. The Men Engage Alliance was actually established in 2004 during a moment when gender equality movements began recognizing the importance of actively engaging men and boys in dismantling patriarchy. So women's rights activists, feminists, and gender equality advocates came together to create a global network that would mobilize men and boys to take responsibility to their roles in perpetuating patriarchal norms. We are at the moment spread across 92 countries and over 1,100 members across the globe. So that means we are a member-based network and a space for members around the globe to come together in solidarity with those most affected by gender injustices and patriarchal systems to collectively dismantle these structural barriers that women rights and gender equality movements are facing today. As a global network, we bring together people and organizations with a shared vision of a world in which gender justice and human rights are recognized, promoted, and protected, where all people are equal and free from discrimination and oppression. So our work with men and boys actually stems from the pioneering work and ongoing leadership of women's rights and LGBTQ movements. This means we root our understanding of the world in a feminist theory and an understanding that patriarchy is a system that the center of women and LGBTQ persons' human rights are violated and gender equalities are generated out of that. So in terms of our mission, Men Engage Alliance is actually prioritizing transforming unequal power relations and dismantling patriarchal systems by transforming patriarchal masculinities and rigid, harmful norms around being a man, working with men and boys on gender justice through intersectional feminist approaches, building inclusive collaborations from local to regional to global levels. And of course, I have been quite lucky to represent all these three levels in my years of work with Men Engage Alliance, and also developing joint actions in partnership with and accountability to women's rights and gender and other social justice movements. So together with women's rights and these other LGBTQ and social rights groups, we aspire to collectively understand, challenge, and transform patriarchal masculinities. This includes addressing ways that ideas, norms, and values around being a man, as James earlier explained when it comes to what it means to be, what do we mean by masculinities? So values around being a man relate to a range of interconnected issues facing societies and the world today. So as members and as a collective, We aim towards a shared vision and mission for positive change and to transform unequal power that benefit all of us. Just also quickly, let me highlight key milestones that was really important to us as Men Engage Alliance. In 2009, we hosted the first Men Engage Global Symposium in Brazil, bringing together practitioners, feminists, activists to set the agenda for the transformative masculinities. And following that, I think 2014, it was really important. This second global symposium happened in Delhi, allowed us to deepen our focuses on feminist principles, accountability, and intersectionality. And of course, taking the lead from the declaration, Delhi Declaration and call to action. In 2020-21, we had the third symposium, Ubuntu Symposium, which was actually held online due to COVID and the issues that came around COVID. So Ubuntu Declaration was built upon the 2014 Delhi Declaration call and the call to action, which set a benchmark for members, partners, and to the broader field of gender justice. So Delhi Declaration and call to action followed a long-standing lead of feminist movements of identifying patriarchy as part of the root of gender and social inequalities. It was a milestone in affirming the work of transforming masculinities as a key approach in dismantling patriarchy. And just in a minute, just since you mentioned that I am the first female co-chair, just let me say a few words on that as well. As the first woman in this position, I think I'm both humbled and energized by the opportunity to lead a global network dedicated to advancing gender justice. And my role symbolizes the Alliance's commitment to ensuring feminist leadership and representation within the spaces actually historically led by men. It was so far contributed to achieving our shared objectives for gender justice and co-creating accountable leadership in challenging the patriarchal political agenda. So I'm really committed in building this alliance, the movement, which will definitely complement and amplify feminist goals. So thank you so much, and let's move on with other questions later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samita. And of course, I think you know that I sit on the board of Equimundo in Washington, D.C., and we have used the work, the research and the work that you have done a lot in shaping the campaigns run by Equimundo. So thank you for that, and congratulations on your appointment as the first woman. So I'm now going to turn to Ravi Varma. Ravi, you've been the co-lead for the International Men and Gender Equality Survey for many years now, and of course have been working in this space for so long. You've been involved in many projects involving men and boys. So what learning can we glean from the work that you have done? What findings from your work highlights what masculinity means and what it means for gender-based violence? What is the connection and what needs to change, which is the most important point? So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Imrana. And if you can, I can look at my time. Thank you so much. Yes, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. So International Men and Gender Equality Survey, images that you referred to, was initiated some time back, about 14 years back. And we were part of that with Gary Barker and Equimundo, who's on board you are. So good to connect. There, that survey for the first time has actually, over the years, has provided data and substance to whatever complex definition James sort of laid out. It really has given teeth to the argument that men or manhood is not an essentialist monolithic category. That's one. So it has moved us away from essentialism to the idea of diversified masculinities. The word masculinities got really operationalized with data from images. But images also improvised itself over the time with the help of many programs that were designed as a result of. So, for example, the kind of programs we did in many countries, including India, provided new data sets to add newer insights into subsequent surveys. So, that means the data and the program went hand in hand to improve our understanding, our insights into what does masculinity mean. I would highlight 4 or 5 kind of big high-level takeaways from these surveys and the programs. One, of course, is that men is not a monolithic category, and everything that we do about men is learn about them is about the context and the ecosystem within which they live. And I think James alluded to that theoretically, and we have data on that. And two, what is more significant is that everything that one learns about being a man and masculinities originates very early in life. So if you want to do any substantive and the meaningful program, one has to start very early in life. So as a result of this learning, that childhood experiences really determine what a man comes to define oneself as. It comes from the family. It comes from what one has seen in the household. And it necessitated that the masculinity's work should not really be only focused on young men, but should be young boys and girls, and going back into the life cycle where they are forming these ideas. In the schools, in the families. And the schools became, I think there are very few programs that are addressing these ideas of gender and masculinities in the school system. And I think next generation work should focus on school. So this is a very very important database learning that we have got on this. The other important piece of that we have learned from the data as well as from evaluations of the program, that men are ready to change. The idea that it's a waste of resources on men. The feminist always thought that men will never change. Men are boys, men are like men. They will always. That notion needs to be reviewed, re-examined. Recognize that there are men, and there are men who are willing to change. They are challenging their realities on day-to-day basis. They are facing the brunt of that change. In fact, a lot of men experience pushback much more violently than the women experience. I can tell you that. So as a result, I think it's important to recognize that piece and look at men as allies, as someone who are also struggling to change this oppressive regime of gender, which is impacting everyone adversely. So it's not us and them. It is not binary. And by binary, I don't mean one has to only go into LGBTQI kind of a, that's true, that's there. But even there, men within the heterosexual relationships are struggling to find what they want to be and how to establish relationships on a different parameters. So I think those learnings from these data sets and programs are so incisive that we need to build on that. So I'll just stop here.
Thank you, Ravi. As somebody who had her pigtails pulled by boys on the way to school on the school bus, I fully endorse any campaign which attempts to change that. But jokes aside, your comments do resonate with me, because I've raised 3 boys, and trying to raise 3 boys in an environment in my country, in Fiji, which is very patriarchal, and trying to get them to embrace that sort of healthy masculinity is quite hard, because the first pushback is from their friends. And in fact, my sons now say to me, "Mum, you've changed us so much that the women that we go out with all walk all over us." And then I say, push back. Jokes aside, I'm now going to turn to James. James, when I first met you years ago, maybe 15 years ago, you were still engaged in that seminal program with the 10,000 men research that you were doing via UNDP, I think it was then. Now, we have learned a lot, immense insights from that survey you did. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the connection between masculinities and violence?
Yeah, great.
I think you have a slide you're going to share.
I do have a slide. I apologize. I know this is a fireside chat, but I just wanted to show one thing from, so Ravi mentioned the International Survey on Men and Gender Equality, and we took pieces of that and we combined it with the WHO questionnaire on violence against women, to really focus not just on men and gender equality, but on men and gender-based violence. So we did interview over 10,000 men across Asia Pacific and in 9 different sites across many countries, Pacific, Asia, across Asia. And then this slide shows we pulled together that data set of over 10,000 men and then did this multivariate logistic regression analysis, or we looked at what are the weighted factors that are associated between men's use of violence against women, in this case, intimate partner violence. And then this notions of manhood. I think this is the slide that shows 2 sides of the coin that makes this connection between our ideals of manhood, men being in control over women and their bodies, in control of their emotions, and in control in their societies, and men, the flip side of the coin of men trying to live up to these idealized versions of masculinity. So as you're looking at it on the right side, these are the factors that have to do with the sort of negative impacts. Men's own depression and self-medication, alcohol and drug abuse, like feeling insecure in terms of being able to perform as the provider. So all of these things were associated. The size of the circle is relevant, it indicates the size of its impact, how strong the probability is of men's use of violence against women. So then on the other side, you have men trying to live up to this idealized version of men being, heterosexual, successful with women, successful in society as providers. So, and then in control over women. So this transactional sex, a number of light-sized partners, controlling behaviors, low attitudes towards gender equality. This is like the other side, men trying to live up to. So I think this gives us a tangible feel that it's actually, this is not just theoretical, it is empirical. Like we can see through data, as Ravi said, that there's something to do with men, masculinities, and violence against women that is very real, and it's playing out. And that's why this is part of our conversation, transforming masculinities to end gender-based violence.
Thank you, James. And I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience about this slide and about your work when we have the Q&A section. We now turn to Saran, our very own ADB. Saran, you commissioned the ADB research in Mongolia, which looked at men's life experiences and the use of violence. So what are some of the key findings from that? And what do those findings mean for the work that we do at ADB?
Thank you, Imrina. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to talk about such important issues with the great panelists and speakers. And we conducted men's survey to better understand men's use of violence against women and children. And we wanted to promote evidence-based program policies to better GBV. And in times of interest, let me quickly share with you the very key findings of the research that consists of the samplings from 400 men. First, 40% of men believe that women shouldn't refuse to have sex with their intimate partners, and 27% of men believe that women should be virgin before they're getting married. This kind of, indicates that this men's behavior and attitude that associated with the rigid masculine norm It leads them to control our women's bodies, as all panelists mentioned, and also it's not support gender equality at all. Even the men reported that they supported gender equality attitude. In terms of the intimate partner violence, half of the men reported they perpetrated emotional abuse, 26% used economic abuse, 20% physical violence, 13% sexual violence, and nearly 11% reported that they raped against their intimate partners. And all of these findings are consistent with the Women's National Prevalence Study from Women's Report, and is also consistent with the global understanding of the intimate partner violence. Secondly, 13% of men also reported that they engaged with a non-partner sexual violence, including individual rape and gang rape, starting from very early age, between 15 to 20 years old. And however, they were too drunk, or women were too drunk to refuse, is most common motivation behind it. And another motivation is that male sexual entitlement. Men senses that they wanted to have a sex, they wanted to show it, they wanted to do it. The consent doesn't matter to them. They don't know or they don't care about the consent. So what we got this message from this finding is that we need to take a preventive action, engaging young boys and men starting from a very early age, perhaps through community-based initiative and school-based programs before it happens at first place. And working with boys also helped them to engage, break the cycle from the generation to generation, because 74% of men also experienced at least one form of the child neglect, abuse, and trauma during their childhood. For example, 19% of men experienced child sexual abuse, and many of them witnessed domestic violence, especially they're seeing their mother being abused. So all of these childhood these experiences significantly increase the likelihood of men to use violence against women when they become adults. And finally, men also suffer from serious mental health issues and depression at a very young age, associated with the masculinity around being provider and powerful and being in control. And 70% of men also reported that they have a mental health issue, depression, which is already high enough the number than compared to global average of 5%. And it's more stressful for men in Mongolia, especially when they experience climate-related crisis. 41% of men reported that they're having a hard time to access food and social services during extreme winter event in Mongolia like Zot. Because in Mongolia, herding families lost a livestock and income, which led to the high level of stress and anxiety among men, as it's traditionally considered as men's responsibility. So overall, this research gave us plenty of ideas and insightful information about how we improve to GBV policies and programming. And this research already informed us that we need to recognize the preventive action by engaging men and boys at early stages through the various sectoral approach by ensuring and improving the multi-sectoral coordination. And ADB will commit to including preventive action in upcoming counter-partnership strategy for Mongolia. I'll stop now, thank you.
Thank you, Saran. So we've had a kind of a global context. I'd like to bring the conversation back to ADB project work and all the things that you've said, the three of you plus Samita and Michael online. What does that mean for our projects, the work that we do? So my first question is to Michael. Michael, are you there? Thank you. What do you see as some of the challenges, the risks, the dilemmas in the work of engaging men and boys in ending GBV? For example, how do you make the case to men and boys? And I mean, just to give you a little microcosm of my experience, in my home, I was constantly torn between correcting my boys when they said things or did things constantly, to which my husband would say, you're sounding like a nag now, which is very gender stereotypical criticism, and letting some things go. like correcting them on some things and letting some things go, and the constant dilemma that it takes to people who are having to deal with this every day, whether in the schoolyard or at their dinner tables or in their communities. So I know that's a very complex question, but I'd like you to tackle it. Thank you.
Look, just to start with some of the challenges, if you like, some of the dilemmas. One is that it's simply harder to get men and boys involved in the work of preventing gender-based violence or domestic and sexual violence than it is to get women and girls involved, for a number of reasons. One is that boys and men in general tend to have narrower, more rigid understandings of domestic and sexual violence. We define it more narrowly. We're more likely to blame victims. We're more likely to excuse perpetrators. And that's not because men and boys are intrinsically ignorant or cruel. It's simply how we've been socialized and what we've been exposed to. Another challenge is that there are boys and men who see, it's not okay that a woman is raped or a woman is assaulted, but it's not my problem. What's it got to do with me? It's seen as a kind of women's issue rather than something of personal relevance to men. Many men and boys overestimate other men's comfort with violence and sexism and so on. And so, if there's 6 men out having a drink somewhere and one man makes a comment about violence or rape that excuses that violence, most of those other men probably disagree, but few of them will speak up because they assume they are the only one who disagrees with that comment. Some men don't get involved in this work because they fear how they will be perceived. They fear others' responses to that. Some men feel blamed and attacked by violence prevention efforts. Some men do want to do something. They want to help stop gender-based violence, but they don't know how to do that, or they don't have skills in intervention. And all of these are things we can change. Before I say how to make the case to men, there's a few broader risks in the work with men and boys. One is that there has been, I think, this productive shift in attention. I used to spend a lot of time arguing for why we need to engage men and boys in this work. Now I spend more time arguing for how to engage men and boys. But this attention to men and boys and engaging men and boys has sometimes meant that women's voices and women's leadership is pushed aside, and that women's knowledge is silenced or marginalized. That's problematic. It's also problematic when women feel that they must include men and boys in every program, in every room. I strongly believe that women-only and women-focused programs, initiatives still are important. There's also an issue that as this work starts to become more professionalized, as it attracts funding and support, it also risks disconnection from women's rights and feminist networks, and risks stopping being accountable, stopping working in partnership with women and women's organizations. So how do we make the case to men? How do we bring men into this work? One way we can do that is to personalize the issue, is to appeal to men's care and concern for the women and girls in their own lives. Although, of course, we want men to care not just about the women and girls they know, but also about women and girls in general. We want them to have a kind of fundamental concern for women's human rights, like everybody's human rights. We can also appeal to higher values and principles. I've mentioned human rights. We can appeal to fairness, to democracy, to bodily autonomy, and so on. A common appeal that's used in engaging men and boys is to note how men and boys ourselves will benefit, how we will benefit from progress towards gender equality, progress in ending gender-based violence. We need to start where men are. We need to start with the issues, the language and experience that men and boys already have, and try to bring men into productive conversations. We have to build on strengths and offer strengths-based messages. In many contexts, that often means saying, for example, that most men and boys don't use violence against women and girls, that it's perpetrated only by a minority of men and boys, although that's not necessarily true in some contexts. We know that in some contexts, in fact, a majority of men, more than 50%, have perpetrated physical or sexual violence, for example, against a partner. We need to start with small steps. We need to give men small, actionable steps they can take to start to make change, rather than assuming that men, instantly can reconstruct themselves as perfect men in every way. We can show that other men agree. We can show that other men support the need to address gender-based violence and increase men's confidence in speaking up. We can popularize violence prevention and feminism and try to steer men away from the anti-feminist stereotypes that are common in our culture. We can provide knowledge and skills in intervention so that a man knows what to do when his brother or his friend blames a woman who's been assaulted or raped. He knows what to say when a joke is made that excuses violence. We can give boys and men knowledge and skills in intervention. We also need to provide concrete opportunities for boys and men to be involved by running groups, workshops, by actively tapping men on the shoulder and inviting them into this work and so on. And finally, we need to build communities of support so that the men involved in this work of personal change and social change are doing so alongside other men and women and others, forming friendships, forming communities, and finding forms of support.
Thank you, Michael, and I particularly appreciate some of the useful tips that you gave us. So I'm coming back to Samitha. Samitha, I want to take you back to the point I made earlier on in the opening comments about how, for me, you know, an old-time feminist like me, it was quite difficult to make the change to including men in the conversation and viewing them as partners in the global campaign against violence against women. I feel like I have successfully made that shift, but I'd like to hear your views. How does the work of engaging men and boys in GBV prevention, especially in the context of the work that you do, relate to women and women's rights organizations? Are there still tensions between them? Michael earlier on said, well, he still believes in targeted interventions for women only. But I'd like to hear your experience about whether you still think that there are tensions between the two concepts and the two types of campaigns. And if you could just tell us a little bit more about how your alliance, the Men Engage Alliance, works on accountability and why this work is so important to your organization. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, of course, I think I would definitely reaffirm what Michael was explaining. Well, I think there are still a lot of space in terms of building trust, and people like us who are coming into this leadership position definitely have a huge role to play in connecting these movements, connecting these organizations, and making sure that we work towards the same goal. But still, just let me also bring key points. Of course, engaging men and boys in prevention of gender-based violence definitely complements and strengthens the efforts of women's and women's rights organizations by taking this transformative approach where we address the root causes of violence and kind of, come together in challenging these systematic inequalities and creating the allies in the struggle for gender equality. We know that women's rights organizations have historically led the fight against gender-based violence by addressing these systemic inequalities. They have been pioneering in this work, advocating for policy changes, providing support for survivors of gender-based violence. So I think the work was already happening. Their work emphasizes the empowerment of women and girls and the transformation of societal structures that perpetuate violence. So women's rights organizations do empower women to assert their rights, build resilience, and challenge violence. This work often focuses on survivors' healing and building their agency and mobilizing the communities, which is kind of, creating evidences that would lead up to policy advocacy at different levels. We know that men engage, the men and boys are often primarily the perpetrators of GBV. Therefore, working with them should focus on deconstructing patriarchal norms, which we mostly forget in some of our work, and also create a space where they could reflect on their the power and the privilege, so that we could also look at these power dynamics that work towards this perpetuation and behaviors that contribute to violence. It definitely addresses the other side of the equation by preventing violence as its source. So it is important to ensure that the work with men and boys build understanding and solidarity with women's movement. There's no doubt about it. It encourages men to recognize their role in challenging this violence, sometimes in their own positions of power, and actively support gender equality and advocate for this systemic change that we are looking at. And also share responsibilities in addressing societal issues such as caregiving and decision making. I think we all talked about healthy masculinities where caregiving is very key, and also like how power is being shared within the decision making processes. This allyship actually need to strengthen women's rights organizations by expanding the reach and creating that kind of enabling environment for the work that we do together. So, and we know that women's rights organizations have historically driven advocacy and for policy and law related to addressing GBV. When men and boys are involved in the prevention work, they can definitely use their social positions, as I explained earlier, and influence to advocate for these policies, reinforcing the voices of women and ensuring broader societal buy-in. Unless the work with men and boys do not lead to this change, lead to changing institutional cultures, and that had been the most challenging part, that we have to focus really as a collective, and the practices that lead to more structural changes, the transformation is not effective. That is why, and also definitely when it comes to this type of work, we know that women's rights organizations also face resistance and backlash when changing or challenging patriarchal systems. And definitely we need to ensure that the work with men and boys help mitigate this by involving men as allies who can counter resistance from within their social circles, reducing the hostility and creating spaces for related dialogues. So I think I'll just, and just for one thing, like when it comes to ensuring the survivor-centered approaches, we know that women's rights organizations emphasize survivor-centered approaches in prevention of gender-based violence, ensuring that all interventions prioritize the needs, safety, and voices of women survivors. And the efforts to engage men and boys must align with these principles, ensuring that their involvement does not overshadow or contradict the work being done by to empower and protect women. So let me stop there in terms of like how this needs to happen, but definitely we know that there needs to be a lot of work that needs to happen to bring us together, have these collaborative conversations, because sometimes we understand that men who are in positions of power or in the leadership, even sometimes within alliances like Men Engage Alliance, are not ready to reflect on the power and privilege. So that is why the work needs to continuously happen in terms of like, reducing the tensions and making sure that we definitely, even as an alliance, we walk the talk. So just in terms of accountability, I think we have
Samita,
noticed.
can I ask you to wrap up in a minute, please? Thank you.
Yes, definitely.
Once you finish this,
I was
thanks.
just going to say that I will put the link to the accountability framework of Men Engage Alliance in the chat box, so that anybody who wants to read more and understanding can go into that and read, because definitely there had been a journey for Men Engage Alliance in terms of accountability, and we recently upgraded our accountability framework with a huge consultation of global membership. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Samita. I'm going to now turn back to Ravi. Ravi, we were so lucky to attend your seminar yesterday, and you gave us so much to think about in terms of the research you've been doing with men and boys. And I was particularly struck with the findings that you shared with us about how boys behave in the playground, for example, at school and so on. And one of the things that you said was, in your qualitative analysis and your questions, that in your interviews with young boys and young men in their teens, they often said to you they were part of groups of boys, and one of the boys would say something terrible to one of the girls or do something terrible, and they disapproved, but they didn't actually say anything. And that point was also made earlier on. But then later on, they would pull that boy aside and say, you know, what you did was not okay. But they don't want to embarrass their friends in front of their other friends. So that is sort of something that I really thought about. But let's turn to what that research that you undertook for ADB actually, what it actually means. What are the entry points for transforming masculinities in our region, in South Asia? And what are the opportunities for ADB to take that information and to integrate it into the sectors that we work in? Keeping in mind, Ravi, that our work is more and more in the hard sectors. So that is a challenge for integrating a lot of the research that you're doing for ADB, including James' research. How do we take that and integrate it into the sectors that we work in? And what are the most promising sectors? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Imrana. First of all, I really congratulate ADB for having supported ICRW and Equimundo to undertake an out-of-the-box study that we carried out for about 2 years in the core sectors of ADB, you know, agriculture, energy, infrastructure, health, education, and finance, to look at where are men in those sectors in 7 countries. You know, it's a massive work. It was in Fiji, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan. And we undertook an analysis of all the documents that were written about those projects to with a lens to see where is gender appearing and where are men appearing in those. And then also spoke to key people in those projects to understand what are their takes on these issues of gender and men in those projects. And then we also examine the larger ecosystem within which these projects are located, you know, agriculture, wherever the ADB has funded. So it's a kind of a, this report is ready, and I really urge all of you, once it is uploaded, please look at that report. Some very interesting observations. It's a high level kind of, we have not done the evaluation of this project. Let me tell you, this is not the evaluation of those projects, but this is an stock taking of those projects in terms of where are they addressing gender and where in that gender men are appearing, you know, that kind of. So now some observation. One, to answer your question, which sector is most promising? So we and our team struggled between agriculture, energy, and agriculture and energy, actually, these 2 sectors, because they intersect in a very interesting ways and impact women, and they have climatic implications, both of them. And then we saw finance as the 3rd sector. So our considered opinion is that the sector where ADB should really focus, it should focus on every sector, of course, because when gender barriers operate across sectors, and all the drivers that determine gender barriers at one level are at the structural levels, and therefore they have implications for all the sectors. So once you address a particular sector, you have to address the driver at a level where other sectors are also implicated. So I think the gender plan that ADB has is so good, it has to only look at that gender plan from masculinity lens and see how at multiple levels you can infuse the idea of men and masculinities in addressing that. But coming back to more focused address, I think finance sector is the one where our vote goes to. You know, we think that finance is the sector which has such powerful platform to influence the gender issues and women who need most attention, because this is where the intersectionality operates. This is the area, this is the sector which really can reach out to most vulnerable groups and women. It is the area where they can challenge the patriarchal ideas of who takes the decision, who gets the money, who spends the money, from in the household to outside. So I think, and financial institutions are most masculinized. And therefore, I think that's a challenge to address the financial institutions. But I think they can learn a lot from education and health sector that they've done, because education and health sectors have shown promises, despite all the caveats, despite all the orthodoxy in the education and health sector, and the fact that health sector having the largest women workforce, and yet women are not there in the leadership position at all. There are hardly 15 to 20% women in the leadership and 80% women on the workforce in health sector. Really presents a paradox. But education which is governed by the pedagogy which is very top down in many countries. So there are caveats, but still there are promises there. But financial institutions is something where I think a lot has to be done. And there has to be a conscious program. There need to be campaigning, there need to be allyship building, complete supply chain to ensure that the idea of masculinity, patriarchal notions in these institutions are addressed. So I think I'll just stop here if there are specific questions, but I really think that you should look at the report once it is uploaded. My 5 minutes is up. No, but it's okay. Yeah, no, it's okay.
Thank you, Ravi. So interesting and so, yeah, thank you. So Saran, can I ask you the same question? So from your perspective, what are the different sectors as that we can engage in terms of the work that we're doing in masculinities and gender-based violence? What would be your choices?
Well, my response is pretty resonated with what Ravi said, because you know that researchers gave us a lot of informations, and we need to, you know, I clearly, you know, see that ADB can play a crucial role in reducing GBV significantly and through the all sector focused projects. For example, maybe we need to challenge the narratives around masculinities in the most, you know, the male-dominated sectors such as energy, transport, construction, and infrastructure sector and its operations at all levels. And we also need to promote healthy, nonviolent, and positive norm for men through the human and social development sector, such as ADB finance, childcare, or elderly care projects, and focusing on men and boys, and targeting men and boys, those who can working on the family, so that their behaviors and attitudes shift towards gender equality. And there's also promising sector is that health and education sector, where you know that we can target the men and boys to promote healthy relationship and consent, and also issue about the mental health, where men and boys can freely express themselves, freely express their vulnerability. And then it's like sorry, I was like in mind. Yeah, the health and education sector is promising, but at the same time, ADB also a big role to invest in GBV prevention. I want to see that, and also the men's leadership is important, like Kelly Bird and James Lang, who motivated us and conducted this survey. So without this evidence-based research like this, we cannot understand where we are and what to do now to significantly reduce the GBV. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saran. So that brings the formal part of our panel to an end. And we still have, so thank you, all of you. Michael and Samita online, thank you so much for participating in this panel. And we are now going to open the floor to questions from the audience, not forgetting the 120 plus who are online. So I think we should, yes, so we'll take one question from the audience here, and then I want to give some preference to online. So please, go ahead. And can you say who you are and what organization you belong to? Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for this really insightful discussion. I'm Marla, I'm with ADB, in fact, the gender team. So my question is, of course, this work that we discussed today, it involves challenging deeply entrenched norms, social and gender norms, and that will surely be met with some resistance and possibly backlash from men themselves. So I guess this is a question for Professor Flood specifically. So how do you recommend that we respond to the potential backlash and the resistance?
Thank you for that. And resistance and backlash is a constant presence in this work, and it's an unsurprising presence. Any effort to make social change, particularly to make progressive social change, is often met with pushback and resistance, particularly by those who stand to lose privilege or whose power is questioned, but also by people in general because of inertia, because of unconscious support for inequitable social norms and so on. So there's always resistance and backlash. And in fact, if there's no resistance, if we are running a workshop or running a campaign and there's no pushback, that perhaps tell us that we're not having any kind of impact because we're not threatening dominant structures and dominant forms of power. At the same time, resistance and backlash can win. And so we have to find ways to prevent and reduce backlash. And I've spent some time working on this, particularly in relation to men, because of course, among men, there's often a minority of men who do respond with resistance and backlash to violence prevention efforts. And so I wrote a piece, for example, identifying 3 kinds of strategies that we can use to make resistance and backlash less likely or less effective. One is about how we frame our work, how we frame, for example, the work of gender justice or the work of violence prevention. And it makes a difference if we can, for example, articulate the rationale, the reason for this work and the benefits of this work, if we can use positive, strengths-based messages, if we can explicitly address claims, for example, about male disadvantage. One of the most common things that some men will say in response to efforts to address GBV is, what about women's violence? What about women's violence against men? And we have to acknowledge that, yes, some violence is violence by women against men. And we have to put that in its context, that when men are subject to violence, they're much more likely to be subject to violence by other men. And that most domestic and sexual violence is violence by men against women, children, and other men. But we have to squarely address claims about male disadvantage. And we also need to explicitly criticise the groups and networks that push backlash. We need to point, for example, to the ways that men's rights and anti-feminist groups harm women, harm children, but also actually harm men themselves. They harm men by focusing on the wrong targets and not on the things that really constrain men's lives. They antagonize potential supporters, and they may not provide appropriate services or responses to men. So there are framing strategies. Then there are kind of organizational strategies. We're less likely to get resistance and backlash if we build strong relationships and networks with potential stakeholders, if we find allies and secure strong community buy-in. And finally, there are teaching strategies when they're in the room itself. If we're running a workshop or running a campaign, we can provide a balance of challenge and support. We can try to build safe climates for people to reflect critically on their own privilege, their own sexism, and so on. We need to give opportunities for feedback. We need to discuss common resistant reactions. We need to discuss guilt and discuss defensiveness and hostility and so on. And we need to respond well to resistance in the room. So there's a range of strategies, in short, that we can use to make resistance and backlash less intense, less common, and less successful.
Thank you, Michael. And actually, the next question's for you, Ravi. So maybe you could address this point as well. But can I just ask you this question as well? So our South Asian region is a highly complex region in terms of multi-layers of intersectionality. So this question via Zoom is, given the culture and social systems that exist in India and Nepal, for example, how can we strategically promote healthy masculinities in South Asia while still acknowledging the existence of culture and social systems? And the example given here is, for example, some of the language of exclusion that is used against men of various castes, the lower, and I use that term advisedly, of masculinities in India and Nepal. That same language is used to exclude women and to exclude men of the lower caste. So I know that's a question worthy of a PhD, but if you could try and tackle it and maybe respond to the comment you wanted to make to Michael.
Well, thank you. In some ways, these two, what I wanted to reflect and the kind of questions that has come are connected, are interconnected. And I would like to connect my response to both the questions. It may sound a little abstract, but I really would like to try and well, I think the work on masculinity is not depoliticized activity. It is an act of, as James was saying in the beginning, is about questioning the power dynamics, the power structure. And therefore, we can't get away from not recognizing that by talking about masculinities and changing men, we are stirring the existing structure of power. And therefore, the backlash is just not from smaller communities or individuals. A lot of the time, backlash can come from the state, from the powerful people, from those who are against women's rights because they see that as kind of a zero-sum game. And therefore, the work with men have to, in our understanding, have to follow the similar trajectory of collectivizing and creating larger network of voices of resistance. We cannot rely on individual changes. We cannot rely for a sustained change by bringing few heroes out there. That's why healthy masculinity or positive masculinity term, when we use, I get little nervous because it almost sounds like we are creating few change makers. And it almost sounds like few individuals are responsible to bring about role model led change process among men, which does not challenge the larger power structure, which is extremely political in nature. And it includes that caste, that it includes class, it includes the intersection of other forms of vulnerabilities where those who are in the position of power would want to retain the privileges and entitlement by creating the outer layers of marginalization, marginalized people. So I think this is the difficult work of working men. It is just not about changing few boys here and few boys there to respect women and say, okay, don't tease and don't harass and all. It's about a long-term vision. It's about changing the fundamental ideas of how we relate to each other and how we respect the equity and equality from bottom of our living and relationships. So if we are ready to go that far, then we should really get into this by creating two pathways in my one, work from the day one to create collectives and collective voices. We have learned it from feminist movement, that's one. And two, create allies, so that this voice remains, that survives. It does not get lost by the counter narratives. You always have counter narratives all the time being generated. You need to create counter to counter narratives, in fact, all the time. And that means you need allies in every spaces who could do this, in media, in social media spaces, in mainstream media, in digital spaces, and everywhere. So I think it's an effort that we all have to come together. All of us who are whichever space we are working, we need to come together and agree on anticipating those narratives, creating counter narratives, and finding solutions to address some specific problems as well as generic problems. I think that's where we have to go. Otherwise, we will be all splintered. We will get, even data would not take you too far. Data will always create paradoxes. And counter narratives are created on data. That's so convoluted. For every data that you say there's a violence, there is a counter data which says there's no violence. Or the women have justified violence. So what do you do with that? So I think there is a very strong need for data, and there is a very strong need for ideologies and the vision that we want to see the human beings. I think that's, if we agree on that, then you work on men and masculinities, then we work, and that will bring about changes. That's what I would say. It will address all the issues that we talk about.
Thank you, Ravi. Another question from Zoom, and this question is for Samita. How does Men Engage ensure that its accountability framework is consistently implemented across diverse members and organizations to foster measurable progress in gender justice? That's quite a mouthful. So, Samita, would you like to have a go at, this is an opportunity for you to talk a little bit more about your accountability framework when I unfortunately had to cut you off earlier. So over to you. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Of course, when it comes to accountability, I think ensuring how it is done within the network, one thing is that while we were developing the accountability framework and when we were upgrading with consultations, we engaged wider membership across the globe so that their opinions, their ideas, viewpoints, and certain challenges that they have faced in terms of accountability are being incorporated into the current accountability framework, so that members also feel that they have a bit of ownership and that it comes from what they really what it really means to be accountable within their own context. Because we know that even well-meaning interventions towards prevention of gender-based violence or engaging men and boys can inadvertently support the inequalities that feminist and women's movements and racial justice movements have been working so hard for years and for generations. So that is why it is really important that we really need to make sure that it is so much based with the membership and within the context that they are working. And just let me highlight key points that when it comes to accountability, where Men Engage brings out these key points. One is to be critically aware of one's own power and privilege and be open to criticism. So within the network, we also need to be very open to criticism, because even within our own platforms, within our own practices, that there might be things that kind of highlight power and privileges and kind of will not bring that kind of political agenda towards the kind of politicization of the work when it comes to engaging men and boys, as Ravi earlier mentioned. So the other thing is to take action to address personal and institutional practices that go against our principles. I think as members, when they do become members, they have to affirm to the accountability framework before they become a member, and they need to get an orientation of the framework and definitely understand and reflect how it relates to their own institutional practices, and definitely at personal level as well. And there's a huge process that is happening within the network based at national, regional, and global levels that capacity is being built. And always acknowledge that any harm caused by our own actions and that action needs to be make amends at the same time. And we know that there can be, actions that lead to harm, but definitely we also need to take action to amend that. Respect and promote women's leadership within the network and of course within membership, and also create structures of consultation and partnership women's rights organizations. So that is what we have been doing over the last 2-3 years. And I think it's a process that definitely need to be embedded into the accountability process within the network. And of course, how network also relate to the other social justice movements. So I will just stop here for the moment. And just to, mentioning that it is a process that we are really taking seriously.
Thank you, Samita. Another question from Zoom, and this is for you, James, and in a way it relates to what I said earlier on about how we conduct ourselves in the household and the family. What do we say to our children or to our nieces or nephews in a way that promotes healthy masculinities? So the question is, how do we promote healthy masculinities within the household and family unit? For example, in most societies, not all, the head of the family is automatically the most senior male, whether it's a nuclear family or extended family. I come from a traditional household in that sense. So in that context, what do we do to promote healthy masculinities? And I might come back and ask Ravi that question as well, although you have tackled that a little bit. Thank you, James.
Well, thanks for the question. I feel like, okay, we're talking at levels of transformational change that is, with institutions and in sectors, but it does come down to individual men being role models for the people in our lives, right? So we're constantly struggling with, what we've learned and how we've been socialized, and the gender norms that we're struggling with. So I think through our relationships, as I said at the very beginning, we're trying to promote masculinities that are nonviolent and oriented towards peace and celebrate peace, masculinities that celebrate gender justice and social justice, and that are emotionally mature and not, and so being able to show our emotions, being able to demonstrate what social and gender justice means to our family and friends and colleagues, and being able to show what striving towards a world free of violence looks like. So it's every day we sometimes we do better than others, but I think if these ideals are kept in mind, and through our demonstration of acting this out as role models, we can be teaching our sons, our children, our colleagues and friends.
Thank you, James. We only have 3 or 4 minutes left. So can I direct that question to you, Ravi, and this can be part of your final reflections?
Yes, thank you so much. I really wanted to speak on this at the moment you said, because I think this whole idea of where does this healthy masculinity come from? It comes, first of all, I think this is a wrong terminology to use, very honestly speaking, because I think what happens from growing up in the families, there is always a sense of loss or gain. And there's nobody knows what is masculinity, what's femininity there. The children are growing with a sense of whether they are losing or gaining. And at that point in time, the parents, the teachers, the institutions like schools, they communicate in a manner which tends to suggest that you are losing or you are gaining because of your gender, rather than whatever the issue is out there. So the subtle messaging comes from once the socializers to institute in them that you are losing because of. Now I've seen a lot of boys complaining in these times that I get beaten up in the schools, the girls don't get. They are naughty all the time, they do all the harass, they keep harassing, teachers don't say anything to them. I get beaten up, I get disciplined, I get to stand on the corner, and then they come back crying to their mothers, and mothers then go and complain, and then there is the pendulum shifts. So we have seen that most people who want to bring healthy masculinities are struggling between these 2 points, where to draw the line. And they constantly use that pendulum movement by keeping gender in mind, that, okay, there is a positive affirmation here, so we have to really promote the girls and give them more opportunities. Whereas that there may be a boy who may be needing much more attention there, and he doesn't get an attention just because he's a boy. And there's a generic understanding of boys are always masculine and they are bullies, and therefore put them on behind and put the girls above. Now that sense of striking a right kind of balance is where the notion of relationship comes and respect comes. The moment you put people and the children into the box, whether I'm losing or gaining because I'm a boy or girl, then we are setting a wrong tone of socialization. I think that's why a lot of education has to be done to the parents, parenting, these in teaching, in pedagogy. There a lot of work has to be done in bringing about that balance. Otherwise, most mothers of sons, only mothers, you talk to them, you have a very different worldview from them. They say, no, I know. And empowered women, They say, no, I have also struggled and I know we girls suffer. But, the boys are being harassed, boys are, they feel so disadvantaged. So they begin to support boys for what they are. And they begin to see positives in their, in their rudiness or unruliness and all that. Because they begin to love that because they want to reaffirm them. Reaffirm them. So it's kind of everybody is constantly, whether I'm losing or gaining, in that mode. It's a kind of zero-sum game that we are playing all the time, which is at the base, on the basis of this masculinity femininity dialogue. And we have to understand that. We have to understand this and institute it systematically through evidence, through practical examples, through skills, through perspective building. It cannot come just by creating few cases here and there. That's what I
Thank you, Ravi. Any final thoughts, maybe 30 seconds, 1 minute, Saran, before I turn to Michael and Samita? I'll let you think about it and I'll go to Samita. Samita, any final thoughts that you can encapsulate in less than a minute?
Well, I think definitely all what we all talked about is very important in bringing these conversations together, but the ground realities sometimes are quite different. And I can see some of the questions that had been posted are really concerned about what is actually happening at the ground level. And I think most of the work that we do with men and boys in our communities are I know that we also try to compare, what we do is more impactful and what others do is not that much impactful. And, maybe sometimes differentiating the efforts that we have been taking, this is correct and this is wrong. But I think in terms of bringing changes, every effort is very important. And also we need to understand that these changes actually happen based on the different nuances that James also mentioned, that is actually defining masculinities in certain contexts and cultures. So we really need to understand those and build upon those actual nuances and see how much of impact we are making.
Thank you, Samita. Michael, any final thoughts?
Yes, just very quickly, I would say, look, I want to end on a positive note. It's certainly possible to engage men and boys effectively in making both personal and social change. There's a body of evidence that gives us guidance on how to do that well. We just need the political will and the collective effort to do that.
Thank you, Michael. Saran, any final thoughts?
Just behalf of the ADB, so I just want to highlight that within the ADB, we just need men's and ally and leadership. I want to repeat again, and also through the sectoral projects and operations, through the strong gender action plan design, we can make a big change. And especially for those, the project team leaders is such important on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Saran. Thank you so much, Michael, Samita, Ravi, James, and Saran, for attending this panel and sharing your thoughts with us today. So this brings the panel to an end, and I think we have a closing video. Is that correct? From Francesco Tornieri. Oh, sorry.
We have one other thing just before that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But thank you very much, Imrana, as well, for excellent moderation and the amazing panel.
Thank you.
So some of you may not be aware, but while all this has been happening, we have this organization that we often work with called Tofu Creatives, who capture everything visually. So Desiree is just going to show us what she's captured.
Okay, thanks everyone. So here's a quick visual journey of today's session. So we started with Samantha mentioning that we need a holistic response, not just laws and policies, but also challenging norms. This is a collective ambition for everyone working towards a future where gender-based violence in all its forms will not be tolerated. And over to the panel, James mentioned how masculinity, it's recognizing ways to be men, and it's important to promote nonviolent, healthy, and equitable ways of being men, and also important to address factors in intimate partner violence. And then Michael mentioned how it's also important to have well-designed community interventions, educating providers, having actionable steps, and building communities. And then Ravi mentioned that men are not a monolithic entity. Men are ready to change. It's important to see men as allies and build allies in every space. It's also important to recognize gender barriers across sectors, and it's the opportunity to transform the finance sector. And Samita mentioned their work on the collective dismantling of structural barriers, recognizing the responsibility of boys and men in transforming and challenging patriarchal masculinities, and how it's important to continue to build space and trust for understanding. And Saran mentioned the statistic on how 74% of men experience abuse and neglect in childhood, and how a lot of these stresses are linked to the men's traditional role as a provider. And it's important to protect young people and follow healthy pathways into adulthood, and important to invest in GBV prevention. So that's the big picture of today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Desiree. It always never ceases to amaze me how you can actually put that together. So we will be using that visual on our social media, and Desiree's team also did some cute little cartoons for us, which are also on our social media, and we can share that with the panelists. So now we go to our formal closing, which is a pre-recorded message by my colleague Francesco Tornieri, who's actually in Tokyo today, and he's a principal social development specialist from the Human and Sector Development Program. We can please play the video.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Francesco Tornieri, Principal Social Development Specialist working on social inclusion at the Asian Development Bank. I was also the team leader for the study on engaging men and transforming masculinities to achieve gender equality and women's empowerment, a stock-taking of initiative in South Asia. Since August 2023, I've been appointed as the first LGBTQI+ focal point for the IDEVAW operations. First, let me extend my gratitude to our moderator Imran Jalal and the esteemed panelists Ravi Varma, Michael Flood, Samita Sugatimala, and Saranzaya Gerelt-Odd for the insightful contributions today. My appreciation goes to Samantha Hung for the warm welcome remarks, and to Yolanda Fernandez-Lomen for framing today's discussion so effectively. As we launch this report, I'd like to close by highlighting 3 actionable areas it recommends, reinforced by today's discussion. The first, recognizing intersectionality. The report emphasizes that true gender equality requires the understanding on how factors like age, disability, ethnicity, sexual orientation, income, and geographic location intersect with gender. Panelists reinforce that addressing gender-based violence effectively demands a holistic and inclusive approach, creating solutions that acknowledge the unique vulnerabilities that women and girls face. The second point, transforming relationship. The study highlights that gender inequality persists in relational dynamics. Today's discussion echoed the need for men to reject harmful masculinities while women challenge restrictive norms. Fostering mutual respect and engaging men as allies in gender equality are crucial to addressing the root causes of violence and inequality, aligning with the report's call to strengthen individual and institutional capacity. The third point, building broad alliances. Finally, the report calls for building alliances across the diverse groups advocating for inclusivity. Today's panelists emphasize that partnerships among individuals of various sexual orientations, gender identities, and backgrounds are vital. Collaborative efforts not only drive sustainable change, but build the inclusive movement necessary to achieve gender equality. This recommendation from the report underscores the importance of engaging men and boys, alongside women and other stakeholders, to end gender-based violence. Progress depends on collective action to create a world where everyone, regardless of gender, can live free from violence and inequality. Thank you.
Okay. Virtual thank you to Francesco. Thank you again, everybody here and online, for joining us. And please join us for some refreshments outside.